When we first got the notation, it was, and still is, incredibly complex. The idea that almost chaotic events have a rhythm that can be musically notated is a big part of all the rage.
Bob's piece is actually very moving for me. Every time I hear All the Rage, it reminds me very vividly of what that night was like. Yeah, the veto riot on September 30th, 1991 was part of a long series of activist events in San Francisco that were sparked initially by the AIDS crisis, which hit San Francisco very hard. There have been more than 18,000 people who've died who were San Francisco residents as of today. And at that time, we were still 4 years away from the so-called cocktail, the effective pharmaceutical treatments that changed AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. There also was concomitantly a huge upwelling of community activism and community interaction, of creativity, politically, culturally, to try to respond to this crisis. It also was a period of time in which we saw the San Francisco Police Department engaging in a series of crackdowns. In 1989, in October, there was a small ACT-UP protest. The SFPD sent half of all the police officers on duty that evening to close down the Castro for about 3 hours to declare the entire neighborhood an unlawful assembly, crack heads, lock people in businesses and houses.
You are subject to arrest on the sidewalk or in the street. This is not over. You're subject to arrest. Get back inside there. Do not walk behind the wall.
Who orders a couple of hundred cops at a peaceful demonstration?
We're not going to forget what happened tonight.
After that, relations between the police and militant activists were quite tense.
There was a piece of legislation that would have banned housing discrimination against gays and lesbians that the governor of California had promised to sign during his electoral campaign.
Those of us on the militant activist side of things didn't have any faith at all in electoral politics, and certainly not in a Republican governor. So we were 99% sure that he was going to veto this bill, and the community wasn't planning anything to react to that. So my friend Bob Smith and I were sitting at Cafe Floor and said, well, we ought to just produce a flyer that says, after the governor makes his decision, come to the Castro for a celebration or a protest. We had a truck rented with sound system to produce a stage in the Castro. We did not get any police permits. We did this all in classic militant activist form. There were about 8,000 to 10,000 people who showed up. Taking the temperature of the crowd, it was clearly a very, very angry group of people. And of course the former police chief who was running for mayor showed up to posture for votes, and a group of militants chased him out of the neighborhood. He ran, he fled for his life and lost his shoe. So ultimately then, that group, we announced that we would be marching to the Old State Building downtown. We were not inciting anyone to go break windows and light a building on fire, but we were afraid that they were going to, and we wanted to channel that towards a building that would be an appropriate target. Well, a building owned by the state of California is an appropriate target when the state of California misbehaves, whereas some local shopkeeper's corner store would not be an appropriate target. So if that anger had to be unleashed, it was unleashed in the right place. And it was actually quite moving going there. When the crowd got there, the police clearly had not expected this to happen. So there was a row of about 3 police barricades in front of the door and a single squad of 8 SFPD officers, standing there watching this enormous crowd swarm down and surround them. There was no way for other cops to get in there. It was a rather frightening moment. For a period of a couple of minutes, those police stood there and held their ground, and we were very worried. Were they going to open fire? What were they going to do? They clearly felt threatened. Instead, they turned tail and ran into the building and hid. That's when the crowd then surged forward to the building, and ultimately the people at the front started breaking windows, smashed out all of the entry windows and many of the other windows on the building, and lit one corner of the building on fire. I was not part of that activity. I was in the back because I was already, how to put it, well known to the SFPD and could not be taking part in any activities that would get me in that kind of trouble. And I was taking notes as a legal observer to make sure that we would keep track of what the police were doing. At the time of the riot, a lot of electoral politics, gay activists in town were very angry and very upset because they felt that we had ruined any chance of this bill ever passing. That, of course, no governor would ever sign it after gays had misbehaved so terribly and had demonstrated that we didn't deserve our rights. Well, that's not how it worked out, in fact. The next year, AB 101 was passed again by the state legislature, and the governor signed it, leading many of us in town to go around that week saying, it's right to riot, that ultimately queer people are not to be toyed with, that we can be pushed beyond a breaking point. There was a lot of despair, ultimately, that we weren't saving our friends' lives, that we weren't bringing about the change that we expected to bring about, that 70% of the country still thought it was okay that we should be denied our jobs and denied places to live and treated to hate crimes and generally excluded and ignored as our community was dying. The veto riot emerged out of that long period of cultural ferment.